A single pistol shot in a darkened Baltimore rail depot killed the President-elect of the United States on the night of February 23, 1861. Abraham Lincoln had won the presidency the previous November without carrying a single Southern state, taking 180 electoral votes against a divided opposition, and 7 states had already left the Union before he could be sworn in. He had departed Springfield, Illinois, on February 11th for a long, deliberately public train journey to Washington, a procession meant to reassure a fracturing country. The detective Alan Pinkerton had uncovered a plot to kill him as he changed trains in Baltimore, a secessionist city with no rail line running through its center, and arranged for Lincoln to pass through quietly in the small hours of the night. In our history, that gamble worked, and Lincoln reached Washington alive. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Here, the Confederate sympathizers waiting in the rail yard did not lose their man in the dark. They found him, and the consequences would not become fully visible for 40 years. The death of a president-elect was a question the Constitution had never clearly answered. The 20th Amendment, which now governs succession before inauguration, did not exist in 1861, and lawyers in Washington spent the last days of February arguing whether the vice president-elect simply became president or whether the office stood vacant until a new election. James Buchanan, still the sitting president and still unwilling to act decisively against secession, offered no leadership. Into that silence stepped Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. A former Democrat who had broken with his party over slavery, Hamlin held anti-slavery convictions far harder than Lincoln's careful public moderation. On March 4, 1861, after intense political pressure from Republican leaders who feared a vacuum more than they feared a radical, Hamlin took the oath as President of the United States. The man the South had hoped to escape by murder had been replaced by someone the South would find far more dangerous. Southern leaders read Hamlin precisely. Where Lincoln had promised not to touch slavery where it already existed, Hamlin's record promised no such restraint, and the assassination itself had hardened opinion on both sides into something colder than politics. In Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, conventions that in our history hesitated until April now moved within weeks. Virginia voted to secede before Hamlin had finished assembling his cabinet. Tennessee and Arkansas followed within days. This was the first great divergence from the war we know. The Upper South departed early, and with Virginia went the question of Robert E. Lee, the U.S. Army colonel, who had said he would follow his state rather than his own preference for the Union. He followed Virginia. The Confederacy gained its most capable soldier and its industrial heartland months ahead of schedule, and the United States lost the time it had once used to prepare. But the early rush toward war frightened as much as it emboldened. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were slaveholding states still inside the Union, their loyalties bitterly divided, their soil certain to become a battlefield. Their governors, with Beriah Magoffin of Kentucky among the most vocal, watched the Upper South leave, and the new administration in Washington speak openly of emancipation, and they chose a third path. Rather than secede or commit, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri formally declared neutrality. It was a legally impossible position, and everyone knew it. Yet for a season it held, because neither side could afford to be the first to violate it. The decision deprived the Confederacy of recruits and resources it had counted on. It also deprived the Union of a buffer. The war that followed would be fought without the long, grinding contest for the border that had absorbed so much of the conflict in our own history. There would be no cushion. And then came the campaign that would define everything after it. Fighting opened not in distant Charleston Harbor, but along the Potomac, almost within sight of the Capitol Dome. Major Robert Anderson still held the small federal garrison at Fort Sumter, and that flashpoint still burned, but with Virginia already gone, the war's center of gravity sat on Washington's doorstep from the first week. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, aging and cautious, found himself defending the capital rather than planning a slow strangulation of the South. And the Hamlin administration, shaped by a president who owed his office to an assassin's bullet and pressed hard by the radical Republicans Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, made a choice the Lincoln government had delayed for 18 months. It committed to emancipation as a war aim from the very beginning. There would be no careful sequence of limited objectives, no long courtship of border state opinion. The war was declared, in effect, a war against slavery itself on the day it began. Wars fought without restraint tend to be shorter. They are almost never gentler. Without the border states as contested ground, the Confederacy had less territory to defend, but also less depth to retreat into, fewer men to draw upon, and no ambiguous middle zone to bleed Union strength. The fighting compressed. Armies met more often and at closer range, and a conflict that in our history dragged across 4 long years was squeezed into something briefer and far more violent per month of its existence. Emancipation as an immediate goal meant enslaved people left plantations in enormous numbers and in many cases took up arms, accelerating the collapse of the Southern economy even as it accelerated the killing. The Confederacy, pressed from a tighter perimeter, lost ground faster. It also lost lives faster. The end came sooner. It did not come cheaper. When the Confederate armies finally surrendered, there was no Lincoln waiting to speak of malice toward none and charity for all. There was Hamlin, and behind him a Congress dominated by radical Republicans who had watched a president-elect murdered and a war waged at terrible speed, and who felt no obligation to be generous. The peace they imposed was punitive by design. Confederate political and military leaders faced prosecution rather than parole. The landholding order that had sustained slavery was broken up deliberately and by statute. The settlement that emerged from this war was not a reconciliation, but a sentence, drafted by men who believed the South had forfeited any claim to leniency the moment it chose murder as a tool of statecraft, and the instrument of that sentence would be the United States Army. Federal military rule over the former Confederacy lasted 40 years, where the reconstruction of our own history was contested, compromised, and abandoned within little more than a decade. This occupation was built to endure, garrisoned and funded by a Congress that never lost its appetite for the project. For 2 generations, Southern society was reshaped under sustained federal authority. Its courts, its schools, its labor arrangements, and its franchise supervised by an army that did not leave. Whether that long occupation produced a more just settlement or simply a more bitter one is a question without a clean answer, and Southern memory of those 40 years would be as divided as the country that produced them. What is certain is how narrow the hinge was. A train passed safely through Baltimore in the dark, and 1 man lived. In this timeline, he did not, and a single death in a rail yard bent the next half-century of a nation's history. The real history turned on the smaller, quieter outcome, and that, perhaps, is the most sobering lesson of all.